We can be extraordinarily self-centered as human beings. We think the whole world is just what's around us and how we perceive it, and we forget to look back over history.
From banks that can't lend to small businesses, high-interest loan sharks, or social investors who just don't support social enterprises, there's plenty to criticise in the world of finance. But a strong and growing network of finance providers are building resilient economies throughout the UK. Responsible finance providers bring social and economic benefits to people, places and businesses. And on the Responsible Finance podcast, we hear about how they build hope, create opportunity and change lives. That's responsible finance. Magic Roundabout. Banknotes you had to write your name on, micro-lending in 1542, and slurping up energy to create cryptocurrency. There's a lot to think about in this latest episode of the Responsible Finance podcast. Our guest is Danyal Sattar, Chief Executive of Big Issue Invest, and he covers whether responsible finance providers should embrace fintech, how good regulation builds trust, and his 3 wishes if he could wave a magic wand today. Enjoy this latest episode of the Responsible Finance podcast featuring Danyal Sattar.
So I'm Danyal Sattar and I'm the Chief Executive of Big Issue Invest. Big Issue Invest span out of the Big Issue. John Bird pulled the magazine together. He was our first editor-in-chief, and he was inspired to do it by street newspapers in the States that he'd seen. And he wanted to bring that concept to the UK, but he wanted a great magazine. If there's a secret to the Big Issue, it's that it's actually a really good magazine, so I would encourage you to buy it. Our vendors, 1,300 of them, buy the magazine for £1.50 from the Big Issue, and they sell them for £2.50, and they trade their way out of poverty. It doesn't quite get them out of poverty, but it's a step along the way to getting back to really to a more resilient self-sufficient life. So about 13 years ago, Nigel Kershaw, who had joined at the Big Issue early, decided to set up Big Issue Invest to provide finance to other organizations like ours at the Big Issue, to other charities and social enterprises that were trying to tackle poverty and bring about social change. So that's what we do today. We lend money to those charities, we invest money in them, everything from £10,000 to £3 million, depending on which doorway of Big Issue Invest you happen to come into.
Okay, great. That's a really helpful history lesson and description of how Big Issue Invest came to be. I've been buying a Big Issue myself for 25 years, so I'll echo the comments. It's a quality magazine. Good. So, Danyal, Big Issue Invest then came to be with an understanding of the needs of social enterprises and charities and the fact that perhaps at the time, they couldn't get the finance that they needed from other sources, and Big Issue Invest lends to them, provides finance to them. You've spoken at Responsible Finance 2019, and you've been talking about, on a plenary discussion, about fintech, about new technology, and about how and whether responsible finance providers, whether institutions, organisations like Big Issue Invest should be embracing fintech. And you described yourself as a little bit peeved at some elements of modern technology. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that's just probably a factor of getting old. It's like I remember when the Magic Roundabout was on black and white television, and when the closest thing to internet was CFAX. So it may just be a function of becoming middle-aged and mildly peeved at the way things are. But I think it's that it comes from a couple of places. I think first is that we can be extraordinarily self-centered as human beings. We think the whole world is just what's around us and how we perceive it, and we forget to look back over history. So fintech, technological innovation today, it is extraordinary, but we're slurping up 10% of the world's electricity, I heard the other day, in generating and mining computer currencies. So fire up your computer, slurp up energy, and this is highly innovative. I kind of think sticking a stick in the sand and working out that the world was round, that kind of took some brain power. I think Galileo figuring out that the Earth span around the sun took some brain power. I think Einstein, with a bit of chalk and a blackboard, figuring out that E equals mc squared, it took kind of sheer brain power. So I think, yes, we are innovating, and yes, we are thinking, but let's remember that people have always done extraordinary innovations. When people left Ethiopia and spread around the world, truly they were boldly going where no one had gone before, and that is human history. So I think there's a little bit about our latest fintech revolution that we think is exceptional, and actually it's not. We always have innovated. I was mentioning I was in Leicester just yesterday, where in 1542 the Sir Thomas White Loan Fund was set up to make microloans to apprentices to buy tools so they could become craftsmen and they could thereby increase their income. So that was microlending, and it's been going all those hundreds and hundreds of years, and it is still going there in Leicester today. So what we're doing today, it's just reinventing it for our generation. And the fintech at the time, I was looking back, and I'm not a great historian of the financial services industry, but I looked up, and apparently the banknotes at the time, they were printing banknotes, but they were the banknotes where you had to still write your name on them. So ultimately, somebody would come back to you as an individual and ask for the currency that backed that banknote, rather than being able to do with a modern bank. You can still present it to the Bank of England. That kind of, so we were on a journey of innovation, and all the way through our financial services industry history, you can see that innovation. So go and look at the museum at the Bank of England, and you will see this history of extraordinary innovation. So I'm certainly not against this latest fintech journey, but it just carries on a long journey we've been on all these hundreds of years.
It's part of a continuum, part of a long journey, and it's a bit of a warning there to not get too excited and swept away by an ego-driven embracing of sort of emperor's new clothes, if you like, I suppose. But that was really interesting as well, about the banknotes and about the 1642 micro lending. 1542, I'm sorry, yeah. in Leicester. Super. Now, you've also spoken at Responsible Finance about the importance of trust and the link between trust and good regulation. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so trust, it used to be that your financial institution was a bank or a building society here in the UK. It had Doric columns on the front, it had gold in the basement, and your money was safe. All those years ago, if you remember, John Smith was leader of the Labour Party at the time, and Tony Blair was his deputy leader. And John Smith was described as having the kind of demeanour of a Scottish bank manager. And at that time, it was considered to be a high compliment that was an extremely trustworthy person, a Scottish bank manager. And this was high praise for John Smith. You kind of fast forward a couple of decades, and it's rather the reverse. We've lost that trust. So I think good regulation plays a really strong role in building trust in the financial services industry. Myself, I'm regulated for part of the business by the Financial Conduct Authority, and I think I'm liable to unlimited fines for the conduct of the business. Which was again trying to, and I think this is, well, it rather kind of fills me with dread. It also is an extremely good thing, because I am personally on the hook. I don't get to walk away and say, it's shareholders' money, it's investors' money, but I'm okay. I am on the hook for the conduct of the business. So it's trying to practically build in something that helps rebuild or build trust in financial institutions. So I think absolutely vital. I think the second bit of that is that it's hard to replicate trust at a systemic level, or maybe it's so considering the instance of that cryptocurrency in Canada.
Yes,
the founder sadly died and had left. There was no key to this cryptocurrency vault, and finally somebody managed to hack in. And lo and behold, to find the vault was empty.
The vault indeed was empty, everything gone.
The same old robbers had leapt up in a new form and nicked the money. So I don't know who was to blame for that. But there was something about blockchain is a fantastic technology that lets you kind of verify identity and verify transaction chains. But at the core of it, you still need institutions that you can trust to hold money. And creating those bonds of trust, once you start going beyond a person-to-person, face-to-face interaction, is hard. And it's not to say that a person-to-person, face-to-face interaction cannot involve deceit. So a tricky thing, but essential to the financial services industry.
Absolutely, indeed, essential. So, Daniel, that's been fascinating. Thank you so much. If there was a magic wand that you could wave that would get government to do something in support of responsible finance, what would your ask be?
I think three things. First would be, because it is a magic wand, I get three wishes. So I think the first wish would be to say, there is that long train of unclaimed assets. These were the bank deposits of, say, our elderly relative. We've done the will, and we just missed the $5,000 in a deposit account that was tucked away. The paperwork was astray. So what used to happen is after 15 years, banks used to say, that money, we'll just sweep it up. It's ours now. It's part of our capital base. So thanks to a long campaign from civil society, that money has been swept up into something called the Reclaim Fund that tries to find the relatives. It tries to find the people who are connected to that money. And only if they can't do that, they pass money on to big society capital and other intermediaries to be able to finance this kind of social investment work that we're doing. A particularly useful form of that has been to the Access Foundation for Social Investment. And Access Foundation is blending a mix of grant and loan from big society capital, grant from the big lottery fund. And it's been a fantastic driver of the growth of small loans for our sector. So my first wish would be that the Reclaim Fund finances Access Foundation for Social Investment and allows that flow of blended finance money to continue to the sector.
Yeah. I
think the second wish that I would have would be that we introduce the 90-10 fund concept here in the UK. Now, it's very difficult to replicate things cross-border, and we could never copy something cross-border just as is. But in France, they have this concept of the 90-10 fund. So 90% of the money is responsibly invested. 10% comes to responsible finance providers such as us. So 90% is on the mainstream markets with ethical filters, 10% to lenders such as in our sector. And the choice happens if you have more than 50 employees in your company. An employee can just tick a box and say, I choose a 90-10 fund. Nobody is forced to do it. It's just the choice is made available. So I would ask that, policy-wise, for a magic wand to be waved to say, give our consumers choice. Let them choose a 90-10 fund. It would have to be adopted for our different regulatory context. And the third thing I would say is the great success of community lenders in the United States came from something called the CDFI Fund, Community Development Finance Institutions, they're called in the States, as we were earlier here in the UK. And that's a mix of grant and investment support for lenders, rather like Access Foundation, but more widely for other sectors than charities and social enterprises. And that kind of long-term, sustained support for the sector was absolutely crucial to the success, or it was one of the many crucial components for success in the States. And I think we need something like that here, that means that support for the sector is not stop-start, but is continued, long-term, reliable policy and financial support for the sector.
3 wishes there, 3 wishes when you wave your magic wand. Let's hope the magic is working and the government is listening. But Danyal Sattar, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thanks Jamie.
You've been listening to the Responsible Finance podcast with me, Jamie Veach. There are responsible finance providers all over the UK. They lend to people, businesses and social enterprises. They provide finance that is fair and also offer support and advice. And if you want to find your nearest responsible finance provider, take a look at findingfinance.org.uk. Also, go to responsiblefinance.org.uk for more details of Responsible Finance, the voice of the industry. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. From banks that can't lend to small businesses, high-interest loan sharks, or social investors who just don't support social enterprises, there's plenty to criticise in the world of finance. But a strong and growing network of finance providers are building resilient economies throughout the UK. Responsible finance providers bring social and economic benefits to people, places and businesses. And on the Responsible Finance podcast, we hear about how they build hope, create opportunity and change lives. That's responsible finance.